Here's Russ Baker.
Thank you. Anybody who figured out that I was speaking, everybody I ran into thought the conference was over or something, but what I'm afraid of is I'm going to start and then people are going to come in late and then they're going to get up. You've seen this before. They go to the microphones and then they say, I don't know if you said this because I was late, but okay. It's one of my favorite things. All right, so let's start sort of slowly here and kind of ease into this because then I will go through like a zillion slides, but they, I hope, will not be too taxing for you. I know these are long conferences and everybody's probably glad to go home, and I would like to say that I don't have many things to say, but I do have a lot of things to say. I had certain things I thought I was going to say, and then I spent 4 days this week at the National Archives where I found a bunch of interesting new documents. Some of those documents will be up on the screen. I don't know if you'll be able to see them. Otherwise, I will try to explain what they say. They include Alan Dulles' own notes from the Warren Commission, where he's actually correcting drafts of the report. And he's changing things and he's rewriting and very, I think, revealing what he was about. And I want to actually start by thanking the organizers of this event and the AARC for what they do. I want to thank all of you for what you do because speaking as a so-called professional journalist, we couldn't do the work that we do in this area without you. And in fact, in my upcoming book, which will be on the Kennedy assassination, I'm planning to have a chapter about the research community because I think it's such an exceptional occurrence in American history. That you people even exist, I think, is something absolutely staggering. You are the Tom Paines of today. You truly are. Personally, I try to remain agnostic and flexible and open to new discoveries and interpretations. One of the things I discovered, I'm a sort of a recent participant in this arena, only about less than a decade, nothing compared to many of you. I discovered that there was a lot of fracturing going on here and a lot of disagreements and so forth, but it's kind of an argument on the head of a pin, really, isn't it? Because most of you agree more than you disagree, and if you compare what you all think to what the establishment has been putting out, you really ought to be concentrating on the common ground that you have, which is quite substantial. So it seems to me to find the plot in this whole thing, and this is what my new book will be about, you have to look for patterns and you have to look for connections and you have to try to figure out if they're random or if they actually mean something. And I think that, I'm not saying that Oswald's not important. I think he is important. I think you want to look at him. But I think if you look only at him or too much at him to the exclusion of other things, you make a mistake. I think that his purpose was to draw your attention. I think that it was a little bit like a magic act where you're looking over here and meanwhile they got the sleight of hand going on over here, or they're picking your pocket over here. And I think it's important to look at Oswald, but I think it's important to look at other things. And I noticed the other day, Buell Frazier was here, and people were asking him all sorts of questions, and he was, it seemed to me, running out the clock a little bit with irrelevant stories, although maybe just what people do, but they weren't really that interesting. And I don't know if you heard my question to him, but I wanted to know, when did you start working at the Texas School Book Depository, and how long had you worked there before Oswald, and how did you find out about it? Because there's a chain of events which result in Lee Harvey Oswald being in that building so that he can shoot the president. Now, how is this not important? Well, Oswald got there because Buell Frazier was there before him. And so this is the kind of work that I try to do. And by the way, I may forget to say this later. I welcome any of you who are good researchers, who are not trying to just really want to do good, meaningful work, to work with me. I'm trying to build a whole team. I unfortunately don't have much in the way of resources, so I look for people who believe in this and think it's important and want to be involved. We can talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's important to work together because there's so many people. I mean, if I asked how many of you have written a book, are writing a book, think you ought to write a book, I suspect it's everybody here. And so the problem becomes we're not listening sufficiently to each other. And I'm actually going through a process now, and I will tell you, I have a decent library of JFK books. I haven't read most of them because if I spent my time reading the books, I couldn't do my reporting. And so I'm trying to solve that. I'm reading some of the books, and I'm bringing in other people who have read these other books and really have sort of inhaled them and know them very, very well, so we can take into account what people like Bill Simpich have done very, very important work. I'm hoping Bill will work with me on my project. Okay, wonderful, because he already knows all that stuff, and then we don't have to duplicate that. Very, very important. Okay, so look beyond Oswald. Warren Commission. Well, I thought that that was what this conference was about, the Warren Commission, so I prepared something about the Warren Commission. Silly me, because I could have brought one of my old talks on something else, because I see we're talking about everything under the sun related to JFK, which is okay, I don't mind that. But I am going to talk about the Warren Commission, so please indulge me. 2020 hindsight, it's easy to say they screwed up. It's easy to say the HSCA screwed up. It's very important to distinguish what we know from what they knew and what they could have known. What I'm looking for when I look at the Warren Commission is clear signs of malfeasance, misfeasance. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not so interested that they didn't do certain things or didn't seem to pay attention to certain things, because we don't know if those things mattered or not. They, you know, as somebody said, Blakey, one of Blakey's people from the HSCA yesterday said Blakey had a report to write. By the way, I'm sorry he's not here because I have some things to... Oh, you are there. Good. Nice to see you, Mr. Blakey. And so he had a report to write, and I mean, I think that's true. You know, he's an accomplished gentleman with a very distinguished record, and you know, this is work. And when you're given work to do, that's what you do. His job was to run an organization and produce a report. And it is true, the Warren Commission also was supposed to produce a report. Okay, so let's give them the benefit of the doubt, and then we can start going after them on some other things. And also, I'm going to show you some things from the archives. Very dusty, by the way, if my voice sounds scratchy. I was inhaling Alan Dulles' dust. And I can tell you, I wore a mask the last day. Pretty rough. Okay. One thing I discovered about the Warren Commission was the extent of the compartmentalization. This is very important. With my book project, I am trying to keep it minimally compartmentalized. I do ask everybody to sign non-disclosure agreements, but I'm trying to not do too much compartmentalization, because when you compartmentalize, you make mistakes. Because other people, when I wrote Family of Secrets, I showed it to a lot of people and I said, is there anything wrong with this? Do you see things that are wrong? The results are much, much better. But the Warren Commission compartmentalized. Everybody was compartmentalized from everybody. The commissioners were compartmentalized from each other. They didn't have a lot of interaction. They rarely met. When there were commissioners there were only a few of them, so most of them missed most of it. There was only one person there who didn't have a job and had all the time in the world on his hands, and do you know who that was? Alan Dulles, who'd been fired by Kennedy, okay, and the head of the CIA. So he had all this time, and he was often there, not always, even sometimes he wasn't there. And then there was the staff who would interview people, and often it would be a staffer and one person sitting there and nobody else. And so who knows what went into that, because they actually talked to the witnesses off the record before they went on the record. So you've got quite a potentially adulterated process there. And then, of course, the staffers didn't talk much to each other, and this caused even more problems, as we will see in a few minutes. Also, I want to say, it's easy to say in this whole process, well, so-and-so didn't like so-and-so, and therefore they couldn't have worked together. the FBI didn't like the CIA, so I hear this all the time, they couldn't have been involved together in this, but that's just wrong. Plenty of people who don't like each other, I've worked together, probably this conference is an example of that. You just, you swallow it, you do what you can to deal with really annoying people or people you think are trying to undermine you. You try to work with them as best as you can when you need to. And frankly, although they talk about the fighting between them, there's a tremendous amount of cooperation between the FBI and the CIA, plus the fact that the CIA had undercover people working in the FBI, and the FBI had the reverse. So it's all one big happy family, I guess. And double and triple agents at that. Okay, let's start looking at the slides. Okay, I found this today. I kind of love this. Don't get in the way. Civilian control of the military. I think this sort of says it all. The dirty work fell to Deputy Defense Secretary Roswell Gilpatrick. He's going to figure in what I'm going to be talking about. On Sunday afternoon, he drove to the Observatory Hill to fire this guy, Admiral George Anderson. Anderson was stunned. So was most of the Navy. This is just shortly before the Kennedy assassination. Quote, "A military man has really got to bow to this Kennedy crowd," said an admiral who was close to Anderson. Guys who get in their way get knocked off. Okay. I'm sure that's what he meant, not something similar. Okay. One of the things that I discovered about the Warren Commission, and I hope this will demonstrate this as we go through the slides, is that you've got to lump the Warren Commission together with big business, big labor, as constituted by unions that were heavily corrupted by organized crime, the legal establishment, the judiciary, lawyers, and so forth, the government, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had just warned us about. That's quite a big deal. We all know about that, but think about what a big deal that is. I mean, could you imagine Obama or Eric Holder warning us about the thing that they were in the midst of? I mean, it's really a remarkable thing in American history, really a singular statement, tremendous import. And then, of course, the mob, or as I like to say when you put these all together, business as usual in the good old USA. And I think it's important with all this to keep coming back to the big picture, because we get caught in the minutia, we get down into the weeds. It's important to get into the weeds, find those bullets and so on, but then you got to bring them back and you got to say, now what does this all mean? Very, very important. And why this all matters. Why does this all matter? Well, I will propose to you at the conclusion that this country has never been the same since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It took me a long time. Some of you have copies of my book I'll talk a little bit about. That was what I knew then. Everything I said in there I think is correct. I was cautious. Some people have criticized me for being cautious. I didn't draw too many conclusions. I simply presented documented evidence. I think it was obvious when you read it what one could conclude, but I was careful. I now have done enough more research that I think it's safe to say, in my own estimation, that what we saw was essentially a coup d'etat. That what we saw was the elements of the establishment who had supported similar coups, and this is all not in dispute all over the world, decided that when the stakes were the highest in the United States, there came a point where the risks were worth it, and it was necessary, they believed, to do this. Now, there are two parts, of course, to the assassination. There's the killing of the president, and then there's what comes after. I focus more on the cover-up because I think it is in the cover-up that you can find the architects of the hit. Now, here's the Warren Commission. I talked to you about the compartmentalization. I'm going to be focusing on one of the senior counsel, Albert Jenner. I think he's a microcosm, but he also was, to me, the most important staff member in terms of the work that he was assigned to do, and I believe that was deliberate. But the way I got started with all this stuff, let me see, I don't know if these slides will coordinate. Okay, you probably can't even read these. This is a document I found this week in the National Archives. They asked each of the staff members, and Mr. Blake, I think you'll find this interesting. I can't imagine you tasked them the same way or would have accepted this response. They had everybody write what their objectives were. You know, when you assign people, you say, my objectives are to do such and such, and you say, right, there is some kind of agreement here, go ahead. Well, they actually write in here that our objective is to prove that there is no conspiracy. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but we can go closer and look at the words, and we don't have time, but that's basically what they say, that Oswald acted alone, that he and Ruby had nothing to do with each other, and so on. That's their objective going into this thing in January of 1964. I think I have some long-distance glasses here. I was given these when I became a CIA asset. That's a joke, by the way, so I don't want anybody using that. Let's see. Well, I think no such luck. Okay, so I don't know what this says. This is Alan Dulles, and he's marking up I believe it's Alan Dulles. He's marking up a chapter, and he's coming up with this whole new ending. And I'll just summarize, since you can't really read this stuff. But basically, here's a Rankin, the head of the commission staff, saying, yeah, you know, I like Alan Dulles' way he rewrote the, you know, there's a bunch of good stuff in here. I don't really like his ending, though. Well, the reason he didn't like his ending was, you know, for a guy, Dulles, who ran this intelligence organization with these very sober, supposedly, reports, that what's astonishing is the purple prose. It's totally inappropriate. I can tell you, as a former journalism professor, I would have never allowed any of my students to write like this. And he put a whole new ending, which was just hammering Oswald and just patently ridiculous in his attempts to make out certain people like Ruth Paine to be angels and Oswald to be this no good, you know, horrible person. Here's crossing out big things and notes on the side and so forth. And there's a thing in here somewhere where he says, there's a thing about a period where Oswald didn't do anything bad. He didn't do anything bad. He didn't beat his wife that week. He didn't do anything reprehensible or express his support for the Shining Path or somebody who hadn't existed yet. But what he did was nothing. And so Dulles, they write that there was a period of quiet in his life. And Dulles writes, probably due to the fact that he must have been depressed and therefore unable to do his usual bad things. Okay. Here he adds the words, he's a mediocrity and a failure. Now, keep in mind, here's a guy who never finished school, speaks fluent Russian, takes care of his family, holds down these jobs, you know, takes the bus to work, very articulate. I mean, we've heard, where is his Russian friend? Is he here? Mr. Okay, right, Mr. Titovitz. And he can tell you what a bright soul Lee Harvey Oswald was. You hear that tape of him where they're joking that they're radio announcers. I mean, really sort of a likable, charming fellow, nothing like what we were told. Oh, God, all right, well, must be depressed, there it is. Okay, all right, and then what happened was, the way I got into this was, I was writing a book about the Bush family. I wanted to figure out what had happened to America. I wanted to figure out, how did we end up with George W. Bush? See, I always start with the big questions. Something doesn't make any sense, like, or who is Barack Obama? You know, I'm always interested in those things, and people always go, who cares? And when I was working on the Bush book, people said, nobody's interested in Bush. He's already been president. I said, yeah, but I don't get what happened to this country. So I started digging into him. And the more I dug into him, I found all these mysteries. And the more I looked at the mysteries, I became interested in his father, because his father was always covering up and cleaning up for the son. And I was struck by the fact that the father was so able to do this, that he seemed to have some amazing pull even back in the late 60s, when he was, you know, not even even a congressman or just being elected as a congressman, he had this tremendous pull to make records disappear and so forth, allow the son to go AWOL and get away with it. I said, well, how do you do that? So I said, I'm going to have a look at the father, because if I'm wondering how the son became president, how did the father become president? Because, you know, we like to, nowadays it's fashionable to say that, well, the son was a nincompoop, but the father was really what a statesman he was. Well, I remember not only that he threw up on the Japanese prime minister and he had trouble with that vision thing, but really he was not really that impressive, if I may use understatement. And so I wondered how he became president, and I went back and I looked at the whole thing, and boy was I in for a surprise. I discovered that George H.W. Bush, just as there were many things I found out about the son we didn't know about, the son turns out to be much more formidable a character than we knew, and the father turns out to be vastly more formidable. One of the things that struck me about the father was that he was director of the CIA with no experience. We'll get into that very briefly. And I wondered, why would they take him right during the church hearings, right when the agency faces possible dismantlement? Wouldn't you take the most articulate, experienced, knowledgeable person you could find? The media didn't think this was strange that they took a guy who, when he was the ambassador in China, do you know what they wrote about him with the New York Times when he was running for, when he became CIA director? The New York Times was trying to find something to say about his ambassadorship or envoyship, and they wrote that he was famed for throwing barbecues in Beijing, and he and Barr would ride their bikes around and wave at people. I kid you not. So I said, there's something weird about this guy, and then I found out, you all probably know this, that he was asked during an interview, what do you remember about the day Kennedy was shot? Where were you when you heard, and what were your memories? And he wasn't expecting that question, and he had no answer. He claimed he could not remember where he was. And of course, I always ask audiences, so I will ask you too, how many of you were 5 years old or over on November 22, 1963? Raise your hand. Of those of you who were 5 or over, keep your hand up if you don't remember where you were when you heard about the Kennedy assassination. Okay, I've done this probably 100 times. There was once one very elderly lady who said she didn't remember where she had been, but I realized she didn't know where she was at the time. Okay, so I was interested in that, and I thought, well, I'm just going to figure out, since I'm writing a book about the Bush family, where was George H.W. Bush at the time? And this is how I got interested in the Kennedy assassination. And maybe I regret it, because I don't think you can ever get out of this thing. Okay, this is the Bush family business, Brown Brothers Harriman, the most powerful private investment banking firm, still around at Wall Street with the same offices, still very private, never in the news, handling the money of very, very powerful people discreetly. This is Zapata Offshore, the oil company of George H.W. Bush, which I discovered when I looked into it that they practically never seemed to turn a profit, and as you'll see in Family of Secrets, by the way, they do have copies here, and I will sign copies after this. I interviewed one of his top lieutenants, and I said, what did you consider your job to be? He said, well, Poppy wanted us always to be out having lunch with important people and finding out what they thought. And I said, really, for an oil company? I don't get that. And of course, they had offices in places like Medellin, Colombia, which was neither an important oil spot, nor was it even on the coast, and they were an offshore drilling company. So none of it made a lot